The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smeared with blood that was not Paul Hadley's own, and the moment he read his dying brother's handwriting, he knew his life would never be the same again. Paul had been sitting on the porch of the Hadley Ranch outside of Abilene, Kansas, in the summer of 1873, watching the heat shimmer off the flat brown earth, when the rider came in fast from the south road. The man was a stranger, thin as wire, with dust coating every inch of him, and he held out a sealed envelope with shaking hands before he even dismounted. He said only that a man named Thomas Hadley had pressed it into his palm 3 days east of there, near the Cimarron crossing, and that Thomas had looked poorly. He said Thomas had pressed a coin into his hand alongside it and told him to ride like the devil himself was breathing down his neck. Paul thanked the man, gave him water and a meal, and waited until the stranger had ridden off again before he opened the envelope. Thomas had always written in a loose, looping hand, the kind of penmanship that their mother had praised and their father had ignored. But this writing was cramped and uneven, pressed hard into the paper as though Thomas had been fighting to keep the letters straight. Paul read it 3 times standing in the sun, and by the 3rd time his hands had stopped shaking enough that he could think clearly. Thomas had been riding with a cattle outfit west of Dodge, the letter said. He had gotten into a dispute that had turned violent, the details of which he glossed over with the particular evasiveness of a man who knew he was at least partly to blame. He had been shot, he said, and the wound was not healing the way it ought to. He expected he would survive, but he was not entirely confident of it, and he wanted Paul to know something in case he did not. There was a woman. Her name was Olive Monroe. Thomas had met her in a small town called Harlowe's Creek, a little nowhere place in the New Mexico territory, about 40 miles north of Santa Fe. He had courted her briefly, the way Thomas did everything fast and impulsively, with more charm than sense. He had asked her to wait for him. She had agreed. Then he had ridden off with the cattle outfit and had been gone the better part of a year without sending word, because Thomas had always been better at starting things than finishing them. The letter was full of regret. Not the theatrical kind Thomas sometimes indulged in, but the real and quiet kind that came when a man had too much time lying still and too little certainty about what came next. He said he feared he had treated Olive poorly. He said she deserved to know what had become of him. He said she was the kind of woman a man ought to build a life around, and that he had been too foolish and too restless to understand that while he still had the chance. He asked Paul to find her. He asked Paul to tell her the truth, that Thomas had cared for her more than he had shown, that he was sorry for the silence, and that if by some grace he recovered and made it to Harlowe's Creek himself, he hoped she might still be willing to look at him. But if he did not recover, he wanted her to know she had not been forgotten. Paul read it a 4th time. Then he folded it carefully and tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt, close to his chest, the way you carry things that matter. He was 26 years old. He had not been farther west than Dodge City in his life. He ran the ranch with his hired hand, Clem Pruitt, a raw-boned man of 50 who knew cattle the way some men knew scripture. Paul told Clem he would be gone a few weeks, possibly a month. He did not explain everything. Clem, who had known Paul since he was a boy and had an old man's instinct for when questions were not welcome, only nodded and said he would manage. Paul packed light. He took his bay horse, a good animal named Duster who had more stamina than beauty. He took his rifle, his revolver, enough ammunition not to feel foolish, a bedroll, and enough dried beef and hardtack to get him started. He wired the post office in Dodge City on the off chance that Thomas had managed to get word there, but received no reply before he left. He rode southwest. The Kansas plains gave way slowly to rougher country, the land rising and breaking apart as he crossed into the territory, the grass going thin and the rock beginning to show through the earth like old bones. He passed through small towns that barely deserved the name, places with a general store and a saloon and not much else. He asked in each of them if anyone knew of a town called Harlowe's Creek. Most people shook their heads. A woman in a town called Bent Fork, who was selling fried pies from a wagon outside the livery, told him she thought she had heard of it, that it was a mining town that had mostly gone bust, somewhere north of the Rio Grande and a hard day's ride from the main road. He found it on a Thursday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after he had left Abilene. Harlowe's Creek was smaller than he had imagined. It had been a silver mining settlement once, and the bones of that ambition were still visible in the wide Main Street, the 2-story buildings that had been built with optimism and were now quietly decaying, the assay office that stood shuttered. But it was not entirely dead. There was a general store still operating, a saloon, a small church at the far end of the street, and perhaps 30 or 40 people who had stayed after the silver dried up, for reasons that were various and probably complicated. Paul rode in slowly, keeping his posture easy and his expression neutral. He had learned early that arriving in an unfamiliar place with too much urgency made people close up, and he needed people to talk to him. He stopped at the general store first. The man behind the counter was short and round, with spectacles that sat slightly crooked on his nose. Paul bought tobacco he did not particularly need, and asked if the man knew of a woman named Olive Monroe. The storekeeper's expression shifted in a way that Paul noted but could not immediately interpret. It was not hostility exactly. It was more like caution or perhaps protectiveness. "Might," the storekeeper said. "Who's asking?" Paul gave his name. He said he was from Abilene, that he was carrying a message from someone who knew her. He did not yet say the message was from a man who might be dead, because he had not yet confirmed whether Thomas was alive or not. The storekeeper looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that takes a man apart and puts him back together to see whether the pieces form something trustworthy. "Olive Monroe teaches at the schoolhouse," the man said finally, "up the north end. She boards with the widow Calloway on Maple Street, which is just the one road over that way." He pointed. "She gets out of school around 4. Paul thanked him and led Duster to the water trough. He sat on the edge of the trough and waited, watching the street. At 4 o'clock, a woman came down the road from the direction of the schoolhouse. He would later struggle to describe the precise moment he first saw Olive Monroe, not because nothing happened in him, but because too much happened, and too quickly, and none of it made the kind of rational sense he could put into sentences. She was 23 years old, he would learn later. She was not especially tall, but she moved with an unhurried confidence that made her seem it. She had dark brown hair pinned up under a plain bonnet, and she was carrying a stack of papers under one arm, and there was chalk dust on the sleeve of her dark blue dress. Her face was composed and quietly serious, and she was looking at the middle distance the way people do when they are thinking about something that interests them. Paul stood up from the water trough. His mouth had gone somewhat dry. She saw him looking at her and slowed her pace, not afraid but alert. This was the West, and a woman alone on a road had reasons to be alert. "Ma'am," he said, pulling his hat off his head. "Excuse me, are you Olive Monroe?" She stopped a few feet from him and looked at him with clear brown eyes. Up close there was a quality to her attention that was almost unnerving, like being read. "I am," she said. "And you are?" "Paul Hadley, from Abilene, Kansas." He turned the hat in his hands. "I'm Thomas Hadley's brother." Something moved across her face. Not surprise, exactly more like the careful steadying that people do when they have already half expected something and are bracing themselves. "Thomas," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. I have a letter for you from him, and I have some things to tell you. I want to be straight with you about all of it." He paused. "Could we sit somewhere and talk?" She studied him for another moment. Then she said, "Come to the widow Calloway's house. She won't mind us sitting on the porch, and there's usually coffee." He followed her down the side road. The widow Calloway's house was a clean, modest place with a small garden that had been carefully tended. An older woman answered the door, looked Paul up and down, and went back inside to put the coffee on with no more comment than a slight lift of one eyebrow that suggested she was reserving judgment. They sat in the wooden chairs on the porch. Paul took Thomas's letter from his breast pocket and handed it to her. She read it slowly and carefully, the way she probably read everything. When she finished, she folded it along the original creases and held it in her lap. "He says he might die," she said. "He does. I haven't been able to confirm whether he survived. I wired Dodge but got no answer before I left. I'll keep trying." "How long ago did he write this?" "It was close to a month ago when I received it." "Could be 6 weeks since he wrote it." She was quiet for a while. The widow Calloway brought coffee and went back inside with a discretion that Paul appreciated. "I want you to know," Paul said, "that Thomas asked me to tell you the truth. He knew he hadn't treated you well, not coming back, not writing. He said he was sorry for that." "He was always more generous about himself in letters than he was in person," Olive said. "There was no particular bitterness in it. It sounded like a simple observation. That's a fair thing to say about him." She looked at Paul directly. "You don't look much like him." "No, he got the easy charm and the good looks. I got the practical sense and the stubbornness." It came out before he had decided to say it, and he half expected her to be put off by it, but instead a small smile crossed her face. "That's a very honest assessment. I try to be honest. It's easier to keep track of." She looked at the letter in her lap. "I don't know how to feel about this," she said. "I waited for Thomas for 6 months. I wrote to him twice to an address he had given me in Dodge and heard nothing back. I eventually decided he had simply moved on the way men sometimes do." "I think he moved on from everything easily," Paul said carefully, "except the guilt. That's a complicated comfort." "I know it is." "I'm sorry." She was quiet again, and Paul let the quiet alone. The afternoon light was turning golden, and the air smelled of dust and dry sage, and the faint, distant sweetness of something blooming in the widow's garden. A dog somewhere in town was barking at nothing in particular. Paul sat with his coffee and felt an unfamiliar pull in his chest, something he did not have a name for yet, something he was not sure he was ready to examine. "You rode all the way from Abilene," she said. "That is a long way." "My brother asked me to." "Most brothers wouldn't." Paul thought about that. "Thomas and I are all that's left of our family," he said. "Our parents died when we were young. We were raised by our uncle, who was a hard man but a fair one. I suppose I understand that when the only thing you have is a brother who's possibly dying, you ride wherever he asks." Something in her expression softened just slightly. "I'm sorry about his injury." "Thank you. Will you stay in Harlowe's Creek long?" "Until I know whether he's alive. I need to keep sending wires, and I suppose," he stopped. "I suppose I wanted to see for myself that you were all right, that you weren't waiting for him not knowing what had happened." She studied him again with those steady brown eyes. "You could have written." "I could have, but a letter can't answer questions back." That small smile again. It did something entirely unreasonable to his composure. He took a room at the town's only boarding house, a narrow, somewhat creaking building that smelled of old cooking and pine resin. The proprietor was a man named Bert Givens, who had stayed in Harlowe's Creek after the silver failed because, as he explained to Paul without being asked, he had nowhere else particular to be. Paul sent a wire to the post office in Dodge City and another to the marshal's office in a town called Cimarron, near the crossing Thomas had mentioned in the letter. Then he waited. He did not spend the waiting time being idle. He was not built for idleness. He offered Bert Givens a hand with some fence work the man needed done, and spent 2 days helping the widow Calloway's neighbor clear a broken well. He found himself talking with the people of Harlowe's Creek, learning the small geography of their lives, and he found that he liked them, these stubborn people who had stayed in a failing town because they had decided the place was worth staying in. He saw Olive every morning because every morning she walked past the boarding house on her way to the schoolhouse, and every morning she stopped when she saw him on the porch. At first, these conversations were brief. She would ask if he had heard anything about Thomas, and he would tell her no, and they would exchange a handful of polite words and she would walk on. But by the 3rd morning she had started lingering a little longer, and by the 5th morning she had started bringing 2 cups of coffee from her own kitchen, one for herself and one for him, because the coffee at Bert Givens's place, she had declared, was an insult to the concept. On the sixth morning, she sat down in the other chair without being asked, and they talked for nearly an hour, until the school bell rang in the distance and she had to go. She told him about herself in the unhurried way of a person who was not accustomed to being asked. She had grown up in Missouri, in a family of schoolteachers. Her father had taught in a one-room school for 30 years, and she had grown up among books and chalk dust, and the particular patience you develop when you spend your childhood watching a person explain the same thing 17 different ways, until the 17th way finally lands for a struggling child. She had come to Harlowe's Creek 2 years ago because the territorial school board had been desperate for teachers, and she had been the kind of young woman who was attracted to desperate situations, not out of self-destruction, but out of what she described as a feeling that the places where things were hard were also the places where things genuinely mattered. Paul told her about the ranch in Abilene. He told her about the cattle and the Kansas prairie, and the way the light came in long and level across the flat land in the early morning. He told her about Clem Prout, who could read the weather in the way a horse moved its ears. He told her about his parents briefly, because it was still the kind of subject that had rough edges he sometimes caught himself on. His mother had died of fever when he was 7. His father had followed 2 years later from an accident with a horse that should not have been fatal but was, in the way that things in this country sometimes were, abruptly and without proper warning. "How old was Thomas when your father died?" she asked. "8, I was 9. "So you raised him?" "Our uncle did, mostly." "But I was there." "That's not so different," she said quietly. He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was not pity, because he would have disliked pity, but something closer to genuine recognition, the look of someone who understands without needing to say more. "No," he said, "I suppose it isn't." On the 8th day, the reply came from the Cimarron marshal's office. Paul was at the telegraph office when the message clicked through, and the operator, a young man named Dell who was barely 20, and wore his hair slicked flat as a tabletop, read it aloud with no particular awareness of what he was reading. The message said that a Thomas Hadley had been treated for a gunshot wound at a physician's home near Cimarron approximately 7 weeks past. The wound had become infected. The man had died in the physician's care 4 days after arriving. Paul stood in the telegraph office for a long time without speaking. Dell asked if he needed to send a reply. Paul said no. He paid for the wire and walked out into the street and stood in the morning sun and thought about Thomas. He thought about Thomas at 8 years old, wiry and quick-eyed, darting through the yard of their uncle's house with a stick he had decided was a sword. He thought about Thomas at 15, already beautiful in the careless way some people are, already cultivating the easy smile that made people like him immediately and trust him too much. He thought about Thomas at 20, riding off from the ranch with his saddlebag and his particular variety of restless optimism, the kind that never entirely believed consequences were real until they arrived. He thought about Thomas writing that letter with a wound going bad, pressing it into a stranger's hand, and hoping it would somehow reach the right place. He thought about Olive Monroe, who had waited for 6 months and then let go and built a life. He walked to the schoolhouse. He stood at the window and watched through the glass for a moment. She was standing at the front of the room, and the children were watching her with the focused attention that a good teacher pulls from students almost without trying. She was drawing something on the chalkboard, a map of some kind, and she was speaking with animation, her hands moving, and the chalk dust was already on her sleeve again. He waited outside until the midday break, when the children poured out into the yard. Olive came out behind them, shading her eyes against the sun, and she saw him standing by the fence, and something in her face went still. She came to the fence. He told her plainly, because he had decided that was the only way to do it. She received it quietly. She did not cry, not there, not with him watching. She pressed her lips together briefly and looked down at the dusty ground and then back up at him. "How long ago?" she said. "Approximately 6 weeks," she nodded slowly. "He was already gone when you were riding here." "Yes," she absorbed that for a moment. I think he knew he was going to die when he wrote that letter, she said. The way he wrote it, it didn't sound like a man who thought he had more time. I think you're right. She looked at him steadily. Thank you for telling me and for coming all this way. I would have come even if I'd known, he said. He asked me to. Something moved in her eyes at that. Then the school bell rang from inside, called by the older boy who served as sort of an unofficial bell monitor, and she straightened her shoulders and said, I have to go back in. Of course, Paul. She said his given name the first time she had, and he noticed it the way you notice when a door opens that has been closed. I'd like to talk more tonight if you don't mind. I'll bring supper to the porch. The widow Calloway makes more than we can eat. I'd like that, he said. She went back inside, and he stood at the fence for a moment, looking at the schoolhouse, and felt the particular heaviness of grief mixing with something else that he was not yet willing to name. They ate on the widow Calloway's porch as the sun went down and the desert air cooled, which it did quickly out here, in the way that surprised people who thought all desert was the same. The widow had made a simple and good supper: beans, salt pork, cornbread, and a jar of peach preserves she had put up the previous fall. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, the kind that Paul had only ever found with a very small number of people in his life. When they had finished, Olive said, Tell me about him. Thomas, not as a man who wronged me, as your brother. Paul thought about it carefully. He wanted to be truthful but also fair, and with Thomas, those two things had always required some balancing. He was genuinely kind, he said. Not in a careful, deliberate way, in a natural way. He would stop to help a stranger without thinking about whether it was convenient. He could make a person laugh who hadn't laughed in a long time. He had a gift for making you feel like you were the most interesting person he'd ever met, and the trouble was, he probably felt that way about most everyone he met, and then the feeling would move on before he had a chance to do anything lasting with it. Restless, she said, deeply. I always thought he was running from something, but I could never figure out what. Whatever it was, he ran fast enough that it never quite caught him, until it did. Do you think he loved me? She said. The question was direct, the way her questions generally were, not cruel but clear-eyed. Paul thought about it honestly. I think he did, in the way he loved things that moved him and frightened him at the same time. He asked me to find you specifically. Out of everything he could have asked me to do, it was the one thing that means something. She was quiet, looking at the last thin light on the horizon. I don't know if I loved him, she said at last. I thought I might. He was very easy to be charmed by, but I think what I was really attracted to was the idea that a man like that could choose to stay. When he didn't, I was more relieved than heartbroken, and I think that probably tells you something. Paul looked at her. Relieved, she confirmed, which I think means I knew somewhere that he wouldn't have made me happy in the long run, that what I had with him was a beginning that was already ending before it started. She paused. I'm sorry he died, truly. I am sad for the person he was and for what he might have become, but I'm not, she searched for the word, I'm not broken. You're one of the least broken people I've met, Paul said quietly before he could stop himself. She turned to look at him, and in the last of the evening light her eyes were dark and thoughtful. You've said several honest things to me this week, she said. I appreciate that. Like I said, easier to keep track of. She smiled, and this time it was not the small, careful smile from the first day. It was fuller and warmer, and it reached her eyes, and Paul felt the thing in his chest that he had been not naming for a week assert itself with a certainty that left him somewhat at a loss. He stayed in Harlowe's Creek. There was no dramatic decision about it, no single moment where he announced his intentions. He simply kept finding reasons not to leave. There was the fence work he was helping with. There was the widow Calloway's barn roof that needed patching. There were the mornings with coffee on the porch. He wrote to Clem Prout and told him he was delayed on important business and asked Clem to manage things. And Clem, who was perfectly capable of running the ranch and probably ran it better when Paul was not there second-guessing things, replied that all was well and to take whatever time he needed. He and Olive fell into a rhythm that felt, he thought, like something he had been missing for a long time without knowing it. She was sharp and curious, and had opinions about everything from territorial politics to the proper management of a schoolroom, and she expressed them in clear, direct sentences that neither demanded agreement nor dismissed disagreement. She listened to him the same way she read, carefully, fully, without performing attention but actually paying it. He started walking her to the schoolhouse in the mornings. Not because she needed an escort. She had been walking that road alone for 2 years, but because those 20 minutes of walking and talking had become the best part of his day, and he was unwilling to give them up. One morning, about 3 weeks into his stay, she asked him directly why he was still there. They were halfway to the schoolhouse, walking through the dry morning air, and she stopped walking and looked at him with that clear, reading expression. "The fence is fixed," she said. "The roof is patched. Clem Prout is managing your ranch. Thomas is buried somewhere near Cimarron, and I know what happened to him." She paused. "You've done what you came to do." Paul stopped walking too. He looked at the road. He looked at the mountains in the distance, purple and sharp-edged against the blue morning sky. He looked at Olive Monroe, who was standing with the stack of papers under her arm, and the chalk dust already on her sleeve from yesterday's lessons, and her steady brown eyes waiting for an honest answer. "I know," he said. "So why are you still here?" He was quiet for a moment. There was a version of himself that would have been careful here, evasive, would have said something about the fence needing a bit more checking or some loose end of Thomas's. He was still attending to. But there was the thing about Olive Monroe that made careful evasions feel like insults to her and to himself. "Because leaving sounds like the worst idea I've had in a long time," he said, "and I think you know why." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning sun was in her face, and a strand of dark hair had come loose from its pin and was moving in the dry little wind that came down from the mountains every morning at this hour. "I think I do," she said. "I've been waiting to see if you would say it." And she shifted the papers under her arm and looked at the road ahead of them. Then she looked back at him. "I think I would like it if you stayed a while longer," she said carefully. "I think I would like it if we talked about what that might mean." It was not a declaration. It was not a sweeping romantic gesture. It was exactly the kind of thing Olive Monroe would say, measured, honest, open, leaving room for both of them to step forward or back. It was, Paul thought, one of the most wonderful things anyone had ever said to him. "I would like that too," he said. She nodded once, as though something had been agreed. Then she started walking again, and he walked beside her, and the mountains caught the early light and glowed with it. The courtship, if you could call it that, was quiet and unhurried. Neither of them was the kind of person who rushed at things. Paul continued to find useful work to do in Harlowe's Creek. There was always something a reasonably capable man with willing hands could attend to in a small town, running on limited resources. He helped the Mexican family who ran the small cafe on the south end of the Main Street fix a broken axle on their wagon. He spent a day helping old Reverend Cates clear the brush from around the church. And Reverend Cates, who was a small, wiry man of 70 who had outlasted 2 silver booms, said that in his experience, men who showed up in small towns and helped without being asked were either running from something or running towards something, and that in this particular case he suspected it was the latter. Paul had seen, in his weeks in Harlowe's Creek, that it was a town with its share of difficult realities, the kind of realities that existed throughout the territory in 1873. There were families here who had been pushed from better land by men with money, and the law arranged in their favor. There were people here who spoke of the Apache with a complexity that didn't fit neatly into the stories that usually got told, stories of raids, certainly, but also stories of agreements broken by the government, of people moved from places where they had lived for generations. Olive talked about these things with a frankness that he respected. She said she taught the children history as honestly as she could, which meant not leaving out the parts that were uncomfortable, and that this had caused some friction with certain parents who preferred a cleaner version of events. He liked her more for it every time she spoke about it. He liked her more, in fact, for most things she said. On a Saturday evening in late October, there was a small social gathering at the church hall, nothing formal, just fiddle music and food, and the particular warmth that small communities generate when they decide to simply be together for an evening. Half the town came, which was not a great number but felt like a full room. There was fiddle playing by a man named Garcia who played with an extraordinary ease, and someone had brought out a concertina, and the music moved between different traditions, Mexican and Irish, and something older that had no particular national address, in the way that frontier music often did. Paul asked Olive to dance. She looked up at him from her chair, where she had been talking with the widow Calloway, and there was a moment where she seemed to be deciding something. Then she stood up and took his offered hand. He was not a graceful dancer. He had learned the basics from his mother, who had died before she could refine the teaching, and the rest he had improvised over the years at the various ranch socials and town dances that punctuated Kansas life. Olive, it turned out, was considerably better at it than he was, and she guided him through his rougher moments with a light hand that was so tactful he barely noticed she was doing it. They were close, and the hall was warm with lamplight and bodies and the sound of the fiddle, and she smelled of lavender water and something clean and simple that he thought was probably just soap, and her hand in his felt like something he had not known he was missing. "You're not as bad as you led me to believe," she said. "I have hidden talents." She was looking at him with amusement. "What are they?" "I make excellent coffee, despite what you think of the general situation at Bert Givens's place. I can predict rain 24 hours out about 80% of the time, and I'm a good judge of cattle. Those are very useful talents," she said seriously. "On a ranch, they are." "Are you going back?" she said. The question was asked lightly, but he could hear the weight underneath it. "To the ranch eventually. I have to. It's my livelihood, and Clem Prout is a good man, but he's not getting any younger." He paused, turning with her in the slow step the song had settled into. "But I've been thinking about whether it has to be only mine." She looked at him. The lamplight was in her eyes. "That's a large thought," she said. "It's been growing for a while," he said. "I thought you should know it was there." She was quiet for the length of the song. When it ended, she did not immediately step back. "I've been putting down roots here," she said, "for 2 years. The school, the people. I told myself I was building something. You have. But I've also known somewhere that Harlowe's Creek is." She paused. "It's a place that's emptying out slowly. The children I teach, most of their families will move on eventually. The silver's gone and the cattle roots don't come this way, and there's nothing to hold people here long term. I know. So I've been building something in a place that may not last." She looked at him steadily. "That's an honest thing to say." "It is. And an honest person said it." She laughed quietly. It was not a loud laugh, not theatrical, just a real one, and it did something entirely disastrous to Paul's heart. "I like you, Paul Hadley," she said. "I like you considerably more than I've said," he replied, "but I didn't want to alarm you. I'm not easily alarmed." "No, that has been apparent from the beginning." They stepped apart as the next song started up, faster and livelier, and someone called for more dancers, and for a while they were caught up in the general movement of the room. But he kept finding her in it, across the space, and more than once he looked over and found her already looking at him. Later, walking back to the widow Calloway's house under a sky so thick with stars it looked implausible, she took his arm without comment, as though it were the natural thing to do, and he thought that it was, and that he could not remember the last time something had felt so natural. At the gate, she stopped and turned to face him. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not a woman who makes decisions because she's lonely or because it would be convenient. I have been lonely out here, genuinely, and I have done it anyway because the work matters to me. I'm telling you this so that you understand what I'm about to say is not about loneliness." "I understand," he said. "I think something real is happening," she said. "I think it's been happening for several weeks, and I think we both know it, and I think neither of us is quite sure what to do about the geography and the practical realities. Those can be solved," he said, "if we decide to solve them." "Can they?" "I have a ranch in Abilene, a good one, well established. It needs a woman who is willing to live on it, which is admittedly a particular kind of woman because the prairie in winter is not for everyone. It also needs, he stopped. It also needs something it hasn't had, which is a family around it. Which is an even larger thought than the one I mentioned earlier, and I recognize I've only known you 2 months, so I'm not making any declarations tonight. But, she said, but I'm telling you the direction my thinking is going, so you can decide what to do with yours. She was looking at him in the starlight, and he could see that she was thinking with the particular thoroughness she brought to everything, turning it over and examining all sides of it, and he waited because she was worth waiting for. "Come to dinner on Sunday," she said finally. "The widow Calloway invited you months ago and you keep politely declining. I didn't want to impose." "You're not imposing, she likes you. She told me you remind her of her son, which is the highest compliment she gives anyone." She tilted her head slightly. "Come to dinner. We can talk about practical realities and large thoughts." "Sunday dinner," he said. "Sunday dinner," she confirmed. She gave him a look that had several things in it that he spent the remainder of the walk back to Bert Givens's boarding house trying to identify, and by the time he had laid down in the narrow bed in his narrow room, he had managed to name most of them. Warmth, assessment, something tentative but genuine that was pointed directly at him. He lay there looking at the ceiling and thought that he had ridden into this place to do his dead brother a service, and he had done it. And somewhere between the completion of that service and this moment in a boarding house in Harlowe's Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1873, something had happened that Thomas, in his dying letter, could not possibly have anticipated. Something that Paul had not anticipated either. Something that had sneaked up on him the way the most important things sometimes do, not with drama or announcement, but quietly and persistently, like the way a river changes the shape of the bank gradually, certainly, until the bank looks entirely different and it would be impossible to return it to what it was before. He thought about Thomas. He thought about his brother lying in a physician's house near Cimarron, sick and frightened, writing that letter, sending him on this road. He felt grief, genuine and sharp, but underneath it something else that was not so sharp, something he could only call gratitude, the complicated, guilty kind, the kind you feel when something terrible opens a door to something you did not know you needed. He would carry that particular complication for the rest of his life, he suspected. But he thought Thomas, in his better moments, would have been glad of it. Sunday dinner was a revelation. The widow Calloway turned out to be a woman of remarkable warmth concealed beneath a surface of brisk practicality, and she ran her dinner table like a small benevolent empire, pressing food on people, and listening to conversations with bright, alert eyes, and occasionally dropping into the conversation an observation so exactly correct it stopped everyone briefly in their tracks. The dinner was roast chicken, which was a luxury in Harlowe's Creek, and meant the widow had decided to make an occasion of it. There was bread and preserved vegetables, and a dried apple pie that Paul ate 2 pieces of, and about which he was not remotely embarrassed. There was coffee that was, he had to admit, considerably better than his. The conversation ranged wide. The widow had opinions about the territorial legislature that were pointed and mostly justified. Olive talked about a student she was particularly hopeful about, a boy of 12 named Samuel who had arrived barely literate and who was now reading 3 grades above his age. Paul talked about ranching and cattle markets and the particular complications of working land in Kansas, where the weather could be spectacular and merciless in equal measure. "Kansas," the widow said, looking at him with those alert eyes. "That's a long way." "It is," Paul agreed. The widow looked at Olive, then back at Paul. Then she said, "More pie," with the air of a woman who had said everything she needed to say. Walking in the evening after dinner through the cold, clear air of the October desert, Paul and Olive talked about Thomas again, for the first time in a while. Not with grief, but with something more settled, the kind of talking about that happens when you have absorbed a loss enough to look at it steadily. "Do you think he would have come back for her?" Paul asked. Not to be cruel, but because the question had been sitting in him. Olive thought about it. I think he would have intended to, she said. I think he might have, even. Thomas, as you described him, was a man who lived by his intentions more than his follow-through. He intended very genuinely. He just missed steps. She was quiet for a moment. I think he sent you because he knew he couldn't rely on himself and he relied on you instead. Paul had not thought of it quite that way. He turned it over. He trusted me, he said slowly. More than he trusted himself, it sounds like. That would fit. She walked beside him, her arm through his, and the stars were out again in their extravagance. I used to be angry at him, she said, when he stopped writing. I had a few weeks where I was genuinely angry because I had made space for him in my thinking and he hadn't bothered to fill it with anything. But anger at someone who is dead is a very particular kind of useless thing. It doesn't have to be useless, Paul said. Anger at the dead is still real. He hurt you. That happened whether he's here to answer for it or not. She looked up at him. You're very careful with what other people feel, she said. I try to be. Is that something you learned or something you were born with? He considered. I think I learned it from watching Thomas, he said, and watching the messes he made by not doing it. She laughed again, that small, real laugh. You are exceptionally honest. I told you, easier to keep track of. She stopped walking. They were at the edge of the main street where the road curved and you could see the mountains dark against the stars, and the little town was quiet except for the sound of the saloon a few buildings over, which ran at a manageable volume at this hour. She turned to face him. In the dark her face was clear and composed and present, and she was looking at him in a way that had all the careful measurements dropped out of it. I want you to stop being careful, she said. Just for a minute, tell me plainly what you're thinking. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I'm thinking that I rode into this town to do something for my dead brother, and somewhere in the doing of it I fell in love with you. And I cannot entirely account for how it happened except that it seems to have been steady and certain the whole time, the way rivers flow. You don't see the water moving if you watch any one spot, but it's moving, and over time it gets somewhere. And I know 2 months is not a long time. And I know there are practical complications between Abilene and Harlowe's Creek. And I know you are a person with your own life and your own roots here. But you asked me to tell you plainly, so there it is. The silence after he said it was about 5 seconds long and felt considerably longer. Then Olive Monroe stepped forward, took the front of his jacket in both her hands, stood up on her toes and kissed him. It was not a dramatic kiss, not the kind from stories. It was warm and real and certain, and it lasted long enough to be entirely clear about its intentions. And when she stepped back, she kept hold of his jacket and looked at him from close range with those brown eyes that saw everything. I fell in love with you too, she said, probably around the 4th morning with the coffee, if I'm being honest. The 4th morning, he said. You helped the Vargas family with their wagon axle the day before, she said. And you came to the porch the next morning and didn't mention it once. You didn't use it to make yourself seem good. You just did it and came to the porch, I noticed. He was aware that he was smiling in a way that was probably visible from a fair distance. Olive, he said. Paul, she said back with a slight smile. I'd like to ask you to come to Abilene, he said. I'd like to ask you properly because you deserve properly. But I also want to be sure you understand that I mean it as a permanent thing. I'm not Thomas. When I stay somewhere, I stay. When I ask someone to build something with me, I mean the building and the staying and all the years afterward. She looked at him for a long time. The mountains were behind her, and the stars were above them both, and somewhere in the town a horse shifted in its stable, and a door shut softly. I know you're not Thomas, she said. I have known that since about the 2nd morning. She let go of his jacket and smoothed the front of it with her hands, a careful, domestic gesture that did something significant to his composure. I have a school. I have children who are counting on the rest of this term. I know. The term ends in December, 6 weeks. I know. I would need to see that the board had someone to replace me. I would not leave those children without a teacher. I wouldn't ask you to, she looked at him steadily. 6 weeks, she said. You stay for 6 weeks. We do this right, then we figure out the rest. 6 weeks, he agreed. She nodded once, decided. Then she said, "Walk me home." He walked her home. Those 6 weeks were the best 6 weeks of Paul Hadley's life up to that point, which he recognized even as they were happening. He was not idle. He helped Reverend Cates repair the church floor, which had been warping badly. He helped the Vargas family, Manuel and Rosa, with their 4 children and their small restaurant that they ran with tremendous pride, build an additional room onto their house because Rosa was expecting their 5th child in spring, and the existing space had grown genuinely impractical. He checked in with Clem Prout by telegraph weekly and learned that the ranch was running well and that Clem had hired a second hand for the winter work. But the best parts of the weeks were the evenings, and the mornings, and the Sunday dinners at the widow Calloway's table, and the long, slow walks that he and Olive took in the cold, clear evenings through the streets of the town, and out onto the flat desert edge where the sagebrush grew silver in the moonlight. He learned her in those weeks with the methodical care he gave to things he valued. He learned that she woke very early and read for an hour before anything else, and that if you spoke to her before she had finished that reading, she would answer you patiently, but with a quality of slight distance that meant she was still half in the book. He learned that she had a gift for mathematics that she had mostly been told was unfeminine, and had simply declined to find this convincing. He learned that she had a strong opinion about the proper way to make cornbread, which was without sugar, and that this was not negotiable. He learned that she cried at things she considered unjust, not noisily, but with a particular tightening of the face and a shine in her eyes that she usually tried to prevent and could not always manage. He learned that she had a fierceness underneath the composure that came out in certain circumstances, particularly when the circumstances involved children being treated dismissively, and that this fierceness was quiet and controlled and entirely unmovable. He had witnessed it once when a traveling merchant had come through town and had spoken to one of her students, a Mexican boy named Pedro, 8 years old and small for his age, in a tone that was diminishing and contemptuous. And Olive had stepped between them without raising her voice and said to the merchant, in clear, steady sentences, things that were so precisely and undeniably accurate about his behavior that the merchant had turned red and moved on quickly. Paul had stood a few feet away watching this, and had felt something in his chest that was probably visible on his face, though he had tried to keep his expression neutral. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday evening in late November, when the air had gone cold enough to frost, and the last of the town's garden had been put to bed for the winter. They were sitting on the widow Calloway's porch with blankets over their laps, drinking the widow's good coffee, and the stars were starting to come out in the darkening sky, and it simply seemed to Paul that there was no reason to wait any longer. He did not have a ring yet, which he mentioned, somewhat awkwardly in the middle of the asking, and she laughed at him for it, not unkindly. "Paul Hadley," she said, "are you telling me you're asking me to marry you without a ring because you planned this and then forgot the most obvious part?" "I planned the asking very carefully," he said, with dignity. "I did not plan the ring logistics as well as I should have." "I see. I will obtain a ring. There is a jeweler of sorts in Santa Fe, and I am willing to ride there and back in 3 days. "You don't need to ride to Santa Fe," she said. Her eyes were warm and laughing. "I don't particularly care about the ring." "You might eventually." "Eventually is fine." She set down her coffee and turned to face him fully, tucking her feet up under her on the chair. "Ask me again, without the ring commentary." He took her hand in both of his. It was a cool night and her hand was warm. "Olive Monroe," he said, "I came here for my brother's sake and I found something I wasn't looking for, which is the best thing that has ever happened to me. You are the most honest, most clear-eyed, most genuinely good person I have met in my life. I would like to build a life alongside you on the ranch in Abilene, or somewhere else if that suits better, but together for all the years. I would like to be your husband. I would like you to be my wife. And I would like to do this not because either of us is lonely or because it is convenient, but because," he paused, finding the right words. because you are exactly who you are and I would not change a single part of you, and that is a thing worth building around." She was looking at him with the shine in her eyes that he had come to recognize as her tears, the ones she tried not to let out. This time she did not try very hard. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He raised her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, and she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the cold November evening with the stars coming out overhead and the frost beginning to settle on the ground. And Paul thought that Thomas, wherever he was, ought to know that the road he had sent his brother down had led somewhere extraordinary. He did ride to Santa Fe. He went the weekend after and came back with a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, because the jeweler had told him garnets were for deep affection and lasting warmth, and Paul had thought that sounded exactly right for Olive Monroe. She put it on and said it was perfect, and she was not performing the sentiment. She genuinely meant it. She spent the last weeks of the term completing her teaching with the same full commitment she had given it from the beginning, making sure each child was as prepared as she could make them. She worked with the school board to identify her replacement, a young woman from Albuquerque named Clara Reyes, who was qualified and enthusiastic, and whom Olive spent 2 weeks preparing with detailed notes and materials, and a level of thoroughness that Clara said was slightly overwhelming but very helpful. They were married on a Saturday in late December at the small church in Harlowe's Creek, with Reverend Cates officiating and the widow Calloway wiping her eyes in the front pew, and the Vargas family filling half the church and someone playing Garcia's fiddle, because Olive had said she wanted music and Garcia had immediately offered. It was a simple ceremony, in a simple church, in a small town in the New Mexico territory that was slowly emptying out but was not gone yet, and the people who were there had the warmth of people who know they are witnessing something real. Manuel Vargas's oldest daughter, who was 9, threw dried flower petals from the church garden, though they were mostly just dried stems at this time of year, and she threw them with the serious commitment of someone performing an important duty, and it was one of the best parts of the whole day. Paul had managed, in the weeks before the wedding, to write to Thomas's grave. He had learned from the Cimarron Marshal's office the name of the physician in whose care Thomas had died, and the physician had been kind enough to write back and tell him where Thomas had been buried, in a small cemetery outside Cimarron, in a grave the physician had marked himself because no one else had been there to do it. Paul had paid the physician for his trouble and for the grave marker, and had thanked him with the genuine and private gratitude of a person saying thank you for something that can never be adequately thanked for. He had stood at the window of the boarding house the night before his wedding and spoken to Thomas quietly, the way you speak to the dead when you are not entirely certain they can hear you, but you need to say the thing anyway. He said, "I found her." He said, "She is remarkable and I am grateful every day that you sent me to her." He said, "I am going to take good care of her, better than you could have, not because I am better than you but because I am steadier, and steady was what she needed and what I am able to give." He said, "I miss you and I will miss you for the rest of my life, and you were a difficult and beautiful person to have as a brother, and I hope wherever you are you can rest now." Then he went to bed and slept well for the first time in what felt like a very long time. The morning after the wedding they loaded the wagon. Olive had more books than he had anticipated, which he received with equanimity, and said good-bye to the widow Calloway, who embraced Olive at length and told Paul that if he made her unhappy she would find a way to make his life difficult from the distance of New Mexico, and Paul said that was entirely fair. The Vargas family came out to see them off. Rosa Vargas, round and warm, hugged Olive twice and pressed a jar of pickled peppers into Paul's hands as a wedding gift, and Manuel shook Paul's hand with both of his and said something in Spanish that the oldest daughter translated as, "Take care of our teacher." Paul said he would. Samuel, the 12-year-old who was reading 3 grades above his age, came and stood at the edge of the group, and did not say anything because he was 12 and therefore could not entirely admit that he was sad to see her go. But he was there, and Olive saw him, and she went to him and spoke to him quietly, things that Paul could not hear, and the boy stood a little straighter after it, and nodded once with the dignity of someone who has been told something worth knowing. They rode north. The territory opened out around them in its winter colors, brown and silver, and the deep rust of the cliffs and the blue-gray of the sky. Olive sat on the wagon seat beside him with her books in the back and her bonnet pushed back from her face, because she wanted to see everything clearly, and she turned her head from side to side, taking it in with the full attention she gave to things that interested her. "What are you thinking?" Paul asked because he wanted to know. "I'm thinking it's a very large country," she said, "and I have seen only a small amount of it and I would like to see more." "We can do that," he said. "There's time." She turned and looked at him with a private smile. "We have a lot of time," she said. "We do." She tucked her hand through his arm and they rode north through the desert morning, and the horses moved at an easy pace, and the road stretched out ahead of them toward Kansas, toward the ranch, toward the life they were about to build together. The journey from Harlowe's Creek to Abilene took the better part of 3 weeks, traveling by wagon through the winter roads. There were cold nights and muddy crossings, and one stretch of 2 days through the northeastern New Mexico territory, where the wind came in hard and flat and cold from the north, and tried its best to convince them to stop. They did not stop. They made camp in the shelter of rock formations when they could and drove hard through the clear days, and Olive, who had been perfectly clear about the fact that she was not fragile, was not fragile. She managed a camp stove with a competence that he respected. She read by firelight for the hour before she slept, and she was excellent company on the road, alternating between conversation and comfortable silence with a naturalness that Paul found he matched perfectly. They talked about everything during those 3 weeks. They talked about how the ranch worked and what it would need and what could change and what shouldn't. They talked about whether, once they were settled, there might be a school in the area that could use a teacher, or whether Olive might set one up if there wasn't. They talked about Thomas sometimes gently and about their own histories and about what they wanted their life to look like in 10 years. They also talked with a directness that was characteristically Olive about children. "I want them," she said on a cold evening by the fire somewhere in the Texas Panhandle. "I want a family, I think you know that." "I do know that," Paul said, "and I want the same." "Good, I wanted to be clear." "You are always clear." "I am," she agreed. "It saves time." He laughed. She smiled. The fire popped. "I would like a boy first," she said, in the same tone she might use to express a preference for cornbread over biscuits stated clearly, not demanded. "Or first or second. I just like the idea of a boy." "I don't think that's entirely our decision," Paul said. "No," she agreed. "But I'm telling you my preference in case the universe is paying attention." They arrived at the Hadley Ranch outside Abilene on a cold January morning in 1874. The ranch was bigger than Olive had imagined from his descriptions, which were honest, but perhaps underplayed in the way that people underplay things they are proud of, because they do not want to seem boastful. It was good land, well kept, with a solid house that had been added onto over the years, and had the comfortable, irregular quality of a structure that people had actually lived in and adjusted to their needs, rather than built to a plan. Clem Prout was waiting in the yard. He was, as Paul had described him, raw-boned and weathered, with eyes that were quietly intelligent under the brim of a hat that had seen better decades. He shook Paul's hand and then turned to Olive and took his hat off, which Olive would later tell Paul had decided her opinion of him immediately. "Mrs. Hadley," Clem said. Olive liked the sound of that. She had decided she would like it, and she was right. "Mr. Prout," she said, "I understand you've been keeping this place running. Paul has said very good things about you." "He tends to be too generous about my particular contribution," Clem said, "but I appreciate it all the same." "I also understand the coffee here has been described as drinkable," Olive said, "and I'd like to form my own opinion." Clem almost smiled. "Almost. I'll put a pot on," he said. The house needed some things doing to it that Paul had known about, and that Olive identified several additional ones, with the calm efficiency of a person who has spent 2 years making a practical assessment of what a space needs. There was the kitchen window that leaked cold air. There was the door in the back bedroom that did not hang straight. There was the entire question of the room that Paul had been using as a general storage space that was the obvious candidate for a proper study or a schoolroom, because Olive had already been thinking about whether children in the area needed a teacher, and Paul had already been sure they did. They spent the first weeks of 1874 in the particular pleasure of setting up a shared life, which involved both negotiation and discovery. Paul learned where Olive wanted her books, which was everywhere, and made shelves accordingly. Olive learned Paul's rhythms, the early rising and the late supper and the hour he sat on the porch every evening watching the light fail over the Kansas prairie, and she joined him in that, and they watched it together most nights, talking or not talking depending on what was needed. Clem watched all of this with the expressionless approval of a man who had been hoping for something exactly like it for years. In the spring, Olive confirmed what she had suspected since February. She was carrying their first child. She told Paul on a Tuesday evening on the porch in the same direct way she told him everything, and Paul, who was not generally given to dramatic expressions of feeling, took both her hands in his and held them for a long time without speaking, because there was nothing adequate to say and he had the wisdom to know it. "Well," he said finally. "Well," she agreed. He raised her hands and kissed them, both of them, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there in the spring evening with the prairie wind moving through the grass, and the particular golden quality of the light that Paul had been trying to describe to her since she arrived, and she had said she understood it from his description, but that you could not entirely understand it until you had seen it yourself. She had since said he had actually undersold it. The boy arrived in November of 1874. He was large and loud and had black hair that was clearly Thomas's contribution from somewhere back in the family line, and Paul held him for the first time in the bedroom of the ranch house, with the lamp lit against the early dark of the Kansas November evening, and felt something that was not a feeling he had words for, the particular overwhelming quality of a love that arrives fully formed and immediate, nothing gradual about it. They named him James Thomas Hadley. James for Olive's father, who had taught school for 30 years in Missouri. Thomas for the brother who had, in the end, by the improbable mechanism of his own failing, given them each other. Clem Prout, when he was told, went out to the barn for about 20 minutes, and when he came back his eyes were suspiciously red-rimmed, and he said only that it was a good name and then went about his work. Olive was back on her feet within a week with the characteristic refusal to be slowed down that Paul had come to understand was simply how she was built. She had, by that point, established a small school in a room of the ranch house. 3 children from neighboring homesteads came 3 days a week, and word had spread enough that by the following spring there were 7. By 1876 there were enough children in the area to justify a proper schoolhouse, and Paul built one, and the county school board recognized it officially, and Olive was its teacher. She stood in the new schoolhouse on its first morning, with the autumn light coming through the windows and the smell of new wood and the chalk dust already on her sleeve, and Paul leaned in the doorway watching her before she knew he was there, and she was talking to 8 children with that quality of full attention that was distinctly hers, drawing them in with the ease of someone who has been doing this since she was a child watching her father do it. And he thought that Thomas had described her in his letter as the kind of woman a man ought to build a life around. And Thomas, in the end, had been right about that if about very little else. He stepped away from the doorway without interrupting her. Some things you just let be. In 1877, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, after the young woman who had replaced Olive in the Harlowe's Creek school, because Olive said that names ought to honor people who had done real things, and Clara Reyes had done the real thing of carrying on a school in a difficult place, and had done it well, by all reports. Clara Hadley came into the world in late March with an expression of considerable irritation that she retained for most of the first 2 months, and then apparently decided to let go of, because after that she was cheerful with the particular brightness of a person who has found the arrangement satisfactory after all. James, who was 3, received his sister with the careful seriousness of a firstborn who is not entirely sure about the development, but is prepared to manage it. Within a month, he was managing it very well, positioning himself as a person of considerable importance in her world, which she seemed to accept. The years moved through the ranch the way years do, with seasons and work, and the particular fullness of a life that has people in it. Paul and Clem and the hired hands brought the cattle business through several difficult seasons, including a brutal winter in 1878 that killed a significant portion of their herd and required 2 years of patient rebuilding. Olive kept the school through all of it, adding students as the surrounding area settled, applying to the county board for resources with a persistence that eventually yielded results, and writing letters about the importance of frontier education to anyone she thought might be moved by them, which included the territorial superintendent, 2 state senators, and a woman in Boston who ran an educational foundation and who wrote back with surprising interest. There were other losses. The widow Calloway died in the winter of 1876, which they learned by letter, and Olive cried genuinely for the better part of a day, and then put the widow's memory in the place she put things she loved that were no longer present, not forgotten, not avoided, but held carefully. Manuel Vargas wrote that Harlowe's Creek had finally emptied out completely by 1879, but that he and Rosa had moved to Albuquerque and opened a new restaurant, and that Rosa had had 2 more children, and that Samuel, the boy who had been reading 3 grades above his age, had gone to study in Santa Fe and was apparently going to become a lawyer. Olive read this letter aloud at the supper table and was proud in the particular way that teachers are proud when students find their way to large things. The ranch grew and settled and became, over the years, something that Paul had always held in his mind as a vision for it, prosperous enough to be secure, varied enough to be interesting, with enough people around it that it felt alive. Clem Prout, who aged slowly and stubbornly, remained through all of it, becoming an institution unto himself, the kind of person without whom a place is not quite itself. On a September evening in 1880, 7 years after Paul had ridden into Harlowe's Creek on a bay horse named Duster with a dead brother's letter in his breast pocket, he and Olive sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the prairie sunset do the thing that Kansas sunsets did, spread across the whole sky in shades of orange and rose and deep gold, as though the sky were making a deliberate argument for its own beauty. James was 6, old enough to be out in the yard doing the things 6-year-old boys did, which at present involved a stick and an extremely patient dog named Biscuit. Clara was 3, asleep inside, having burned through her considerable daily energy and surrendered to the evening with the completeness of very young children. Olive was sitting with a book open in her lap that she was not currently reading because the sunset required looking at. "Do you think about it?" she said. Paul knew what she meant. They had developed over the years the ease of people who do not always need to specify. "Thomas, all of it, that you almost didn't come. That you could have written a letter instead." He thought about it. "I think about Thomas," he said. "Not every day anymore, but often. I think about the letter he wrote and what it cost him to write it. I think he made one genuinely selfless act at the end of his life, which was sending me. To find you." She looked at him sideways. In the fading light she looked both exactly herself and somehow also like the woman he had first seen walking down the road in Harlowe's Creek, composed, clear-eyed, with the chalk dust on her sleeve and the papers under her arm, and the quality of a person thinking about something that genuinely mattered. "I was not expecting you," she said. "I want to say that. I had stopped expecting anything in particular. I had my school and my work, and I thought that was enough, and it was. But you," she paused, "you were not something I was waiting for. You were something that arrived and turned out to be essential." He reached over and took her hand. "You undid me," he said, "completely, which I am aware is not the most dignified thing to admit." "You tell me honest things," she said. "It would be undignified not to." James shouted something incomprehensible from the yard, having apparently won a battle with the stick, and Biscuit barked once in support. The last light was pulling away from the sky, leaving the deep blue of the Kansas evening settling down over the prairie, and the first stars were coming out. "Thank you," Paul said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For sitting down in that chair, for bringing me coffee, for not turning me away when I arrived on your road carrying difficult news." He paused, "For saying yes." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she said, "for actually coming, for not writing a letter." "I almost did," he admitted. "I know, I've always known you almost did." She smiled. "I'm glad you didn't." James came running up the porch steps with the stick and an important announcement about something the dog had done, and they made room for him between them on the bench. And Paul put his arm around Olive, and she leaned into him as James described, at considerable length and with great enthusiasm, the full nature of the dog's accomplishment. Inside the house, Clara slept. Outside, the prairie settled into the dark. The stars came out thick and brilliant the way they did out here, with no city lights for 100 miles to diminish them. The wind moved through the grass in the long, low sound that Paul had grown up with and that Olive had grown to love. This was the life they had built, not from plan or scheme or anything so deliberate as choosing. Built from a brother's last request, from a long ride south, from coffee on a porch and honest words in the evening, and the slow, certain way that real things grow when you give them the right conditions. Built from grief, and from the particular grace that sometimes comes attached to grief, when you follow the road it opens and find yourself somewhere you would not have thought to go, but that turns out to be exactly where you needed to be. Paul thought of Thomas. He always would in these quiet moments. He thought, "I kept my promise. I found her." He had not expected that finding her would undo him. He had not expected that being undone would turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to him. But there it was. There they were, the porch, the prairie, the dark Kansas sky blazing with stars, his son between them telling a story about a dog, his daughter asleep inside, his wife's warmth against his side and her hand in his, and the book still open in her lap that she would get back to in an hour when James was in bed, and the evening had gone quiet again. He looked out at the dark prairie, and he was entirely, completely, unreservedly home. And somewhere east of the Rio Grande, in a small cemetery outside Cimarron, under a marker that a kind physician had placed, and that Paul had arranged to have properly engraved the following spring, a man named Thomas Hadley rested in the good red earth of the territory. Restless no more. At peace, maybe. His last act standing solid and real and living in the world he had left, in a man who had ridden because he was asked, in a woman who had said yes without being afraid, in a boy who had his dark hair, in a little girl who would grow up knowing his name, in a life that had started as a promise to the dying and had become, simply, everything.